Biology and the Mind, Structure and Function of the Nervous System, Neurochemistry Simplified. Again, looking at this from the outside in, top to bottom, here we are in our flow. We will begin with the basics of neuron anatomy. It is important to learn some of the basics of this neuroanatomy, as well as the neurochemistry of the central and peripheral nervous system, especially when we start exploring mental health disorders, trauma, and addiction. The neuron is the main cell of the nervous system, and the neurons are metabolically aerobic with a high demand for glucose and oxygen. They have a very small energy reserve, which makes them dependent upon nearly continuous supply of both glucose and oxygen for proper function. This is really important to remember when we discuss things like diet and medication and other lifestyle activities like smoking and drinking. It is also important to remember when we think about neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So we've got the soma, which is the cell body. It has projections on it that are called dendrites that receive impulses from other neurons, and those impulses are passed along to the next cell body. From that cell body, there can be a single long process called an axon, which conducts nerve impulses away to the dendrites, other neurons, to muscles, and to glands. Of course, there are the axons, which connect between the cell bodies. So a single axon may synapse with several or even hundreds of neurons. They can branch profusely, making contact with multiple neuronal cells or only a few specific target neurons. The axons of nearly all neurons are covered with myelin, which is a fatty white substance. The myelin, which is that fatty white substance, acts as a conductor along the axon, and these myelinated nerves conduct messages quickly, where unmyelinated are relatively slower. So the glial cells, there's various subtypes. There's the astroglia, the oligodendrocytes, and the microglia. The astrocytes function as structural support for the neurons. They are active in neuronal metabolism, especially for carbohydrates. They play an important role in the uptake of released neurotransmitters. They contribute to the formation, functional regulation, and repair of the blood-brain barrier, and also may be involved in the immune response. Oligodendrocytes provide myelination of the axons. Again, myelin is made up of that fat. The microglia are sort of a cleanup crew. They provide a process called phagocytosis, which is essentially ingestion and elimination. They are involved in the immune response. There is something that is called the glymphatic system, which is recently discovered. It's led to greater understanding of the interaction between the immune system and the cerebral spinal fluid. It is implicated in neurodegenerative conditions. The glymphatic system is really only active during restful sleep. I'm not going to be going into it a whole lot here, but I do encourage you to explore about this promising research that has been conducted. Perhaps think about things like craniosacral therapy and other healing modalities that influence the cerebral spinal fluid, biodynamic craniosacral therapy, things like that, and how those techniques might be helpful. A couple video on here about the nervous system and a little bit about the glial cells and the introduction to neurophysiology. Next, we will talk about electrochemistry of the nervous system. So I talked about this. The signals from the cell body, the soma, move down the axon. It happens as an electrical charge. That's called an ionic current. Think back to Physiology 101 and the polarization-depolarization of the cell membrane. So the current, this ionic current, is regulated by and consists of electrolytes in the bodily fluids, primarily sodium, potassium, magnesium, chloride, and calcium. Again, keep this in mind when we talk about nutrition, medications, and of course the ingestion of mood-altering chemicals. Again, myelin, the myelinated nerves, axons are fast, and phylogenetically they are newer. The unmyelinated, again, are relatively slow, and phylogenetically they're older. So the signals travel down the axons to the terminal where there are vesicles that contain neurotransmitters. The motor neurons are classified as efferent and transmit impulses toward muscles or glands, while the sensory neurons are classified as afferent, which sends impulses toward the central nervous system. The vesicles release neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft, and the neurotransmitters are released into the synaptic cleft. They either are taken up by the receptors on the connecting cell body or dendrite, or they are brought back into the axon terminal. The receptor cells take up the neurotransmitter at the target location and propagate the signal along the connecting structure and so on until the target area is reached or the process is stopped for whatever reason. Neurotransmitters are then resorbed through the reuptake pump to be reused at the axon terminal. Here's a couple of videos to help really solidify and better explain the entire process. Some main chemicals of the nervous system. We will start out with acetylcholine or acetylcholine, tomato, depends on who you talk to. So acetylcholine is one of the most widespread chemical mediators, and it plays an important role in the central nervous system in maintaining cognitive function and has a major role in the peripheral nervous system, where it is released by motor neurons and neurons of the autonomic nervous system. Damage to the cholinergic neurons of the central nervous system is associated with Alzheimer's disease. So some of the things that acetylcholine does is that it acts to slow the heart rate, it constricts the bronchi, it stimulates intestinal smooth muscles. The source of this is involved in learning and memory. The neurons that contain acetylcholine exist in the brain. There are targets, the skeletal muscle, brain, multiple organs. It really acts at what's called the neuromuscular junction. And the receptors are classified as nicotinic and muscarinic. There are agonists, the nicotine, muscarine, cholinesterase inhibitors, and then there are the antagonists. So the agonists are one that cause the reaction. The antagonist is the one that stops or slows the reaction. Glutamate is a primary excitatory transmitter in the central nervous system. It is abundant in the brain synapses. Of course, it's found throughout the brain, and it profoundly affects disease and injury. Signals are sent to other cells in the nervous system, in the central nervous system. Again, it is a primary excitatory neurotransmitter, and GABA is the chief inhibitory neurotransmitter. Talk about that in a bit. GABA is the gamma-aminobutyric acid. The amino acid glycine is another inhibitory neurotransmitter and is found in the spinal cord. The excitotoxicity in the hippocampus is linked to decreased regeneration of neurons and dendrite branching, which can lead to impaired spatial learning. There can be a disruption of reuptake from the synapses, which may reduce sensitivity to reward and increase symptoms of depression. This is important when we talk about the reward motivation cycles. Ketamine targets glutamate and glutamate receptors. Now, ketamine, if you're not familiar with this, is a drug that is being used in the treatment of things like PTSD and depression. It has short-acting hallucinogenic effects and has been shown to be helpful with what was previously classified as untreatable mental health issues, again, with things like PTSD and depression. Now, the glial cells, primarily the microglia, play a key role in modulating extracellular glutamate levels. Remember, I said the microglia are the ones that kind of play cleanup. We will move on to dopamine, which is involved in many functions, including motor control, reward, reinforcement, and motivation. It is oftentimes referred to as the feel-good neurotransmitter, as it's related to the pleasure and reward centers in the brain. Dopamine is central to associative learning. So when we think about things like pleasure and reward, we know that dopamine mediates action value comparisons and control. So it really helps with encoding action-specific value signals. It maintains, updates, and tracks progress value representations and goal direction sequential actions. Again, think about motivation, think about reward, and when people continue behaviors that they get rewarded for, how that then helps them in functioning in their daily life, even though it may look very dysfunctional from the outside. So excess levels are implicated in schizophrenia. This is known as the dopamine hypothesis. So what the thinking is here is that cells from the substantia nigra to the basal ganglia or the striatum mediates motor movement. Excessive amounts of dopamine create hyperkinetic movements. So think of things like tardive dyskinesia, which is uncontrolled movements that people can have as a result of certain medications that people are taking for symptoms of schizophrenia. The fibers from the ventral tegmentum to the nucleus accumbens is thought to mediate aggression. Ventral tegmentum to the prefrontal cortex helps to regulate emotions and affect. Nicotine releases dopamine, which may alleviate negative symptoms of schizophrenia. And one thing, if you talk to people that work with people that have severe persistent mental health issues like schizophrenia, the vast majority of them smoke cigarettes. And this is kind of one of the reasons why. In the hypothalamus, fibers from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary inhibit prolactin release, and this can lead to excessive amounts, leading to amenorrhea, sexual dysfunction, and osteoporosis. Again, something that may also be found in people that have diagnosis of schizophrenia. All right, moving on to noradrenaline, also known as norepinephrine. It is the primary neurotransmitter in the sympathetic nervous system. Here it helps to regulate various organ systems in the body. So it acts as a hormone outside of the central nervous system. That's what we refer to as adrenaline. It has the action of raising blood pressure, increasing heart rate, creating alterations in digestion and excretion. So when someone is in that sympathetic overload, that fight or flight response, there can be slowing or stopping of elimination within the intestines, or even cause uncontrolled urination in times of extreme fear. It's arousal, energy, drive, stimulation, and even associated with aggressive or overly assertive behavior. Norepinephrine acts in the sympathetic nervous system as fight or flight, as a chemical reaction that is important in survival, but is detrimental when the sympathetic nervous system is always on alert, which will be talked about more in other PowerPoints. Deficiencies of norepinephrine can be implicated in a lack of energy, motivation. It can create depression. It helps to control the descending pain pathways. So adrenaline is secreted by the adrenal medulla, the inner area of the adrenal glands. It increases blood pressure, respiration. It helps to open up the breathing tubes. It prepares muscles for exertion, increased blood sugar levels, which is quick energy in that preparation for fight or flight. And it is synthesized from noradrenaline. Now, with noradrenaline, this functions as a neurotransmitter. It's produced by the adrenal medulla and the sympathetic nervous system. It is actually synthesized from dopamine, and I want you to think about this in implications if you're attacked. So dopamine helps with memory and motor control. It might be a good idea to remember when you got attacked and what you did to survive. So this is important to keep in mind when we talk about trauma. Serotonin is involved in functions such as sleep, memory, appetite, mood, and others. It's almost exclusively produced in the intestines in response to food. It plays a major role in digestion. It helps to stabilize mood. It helps with feelings of well-being and happiness. And of course, it supports good sleep. It supports sexual function, bone health, and even blood clotting. Now, diet and exercise are key to a balanced, healthy levels of serotonin. There is something that is called serotonin syndrome, which is an excess of serotonin. This is actually a medical emergency. The symptoms are insomnia, restlessness, increased startle response, anxiety, disorientation, those types of things. It can be brought on by taking large amounts of MAOIs or SSRIs, which are antidepressants, cough medications, abused narcotics, and again, this is a medical emergency. When there's a deficiency of serotonin, people can be described being anxious, feeling depressed, excessive amounts of worry, panic, phobia, obsession, even things like premenstrual syndrome, GI distress, and cravings for carbohydrates. Histamine is important for metabolism, temperature control, and regulation of various hormones, as well as sleep-wake cycles. Interestingly enough, histamine is found in plants, bacteria, and insect venom. Most of us know that if you are allergic to poison ivy, or if you have that itching from a mosquito bite. The granules found in mast cells, which are found in connective tissue and are an important part of the nervous system. The histamine causes smooth muscles to contract, so think about the lungs, uterus, and stomach. Blood vessels dilate, which increase permeability and raise blood pressure and heart rate, and also gastric juices, so it can cause upset stomach. So histamine as a neurotransmitter is excitatory. There is the activation of NMDA, which is N-methyl D-aspartic acid, or N-methyl D-aspartate, which is an amino acid that is derived, a derivative that acts as a specific agonist at the NMDA receptor, which mimics the action of glutamate. It's also activated at mu opioid receptors, at dopamine, D2, and some serotonin receptors can increase the release of neuronal histamine. So reducing seizure activities, histamine can help with that, and it may also enhance learning and retention. It is thought to contribute to vascular changes in the brain that are associated with Alzheimer's. So finishing up with a few more important chemicals, GABA, which is synthesized from glutamate, is inhibitory. It acts as a chemical messenger. It's found in fermented foods, things like kombucha, kimchi, and sauerkraut, and it is produced by the beta cells of the pancreas. Melatonin is produced in the pineal gland, a very small gland towards the back of our brain. It's important for healthy sleep-wake cycles, like it's involved in the circadian rhythm, regulation of body temperature and blood pressure. It reduces levels of dopamine, and it may also be important in mood and affect disorders. Then there's endorphins. It's most of us know this, like things like the runner's high. So endorphins help to increase a sense of euphoria, but it also acts to reduce pain. It's produced in the anterior pituitary and in the CNS. It acts on the opiate receptors in the brain. And then finally, there is nitric oxide, which functions as a signaling molecule which transmits messages to the cardiovascular system, nerves, and the immune system. It's pretty small, and it allows diffusion across the cell membrane, and it is a powerful vasodilator. So in summary, the nervous tissue of the brain and spinal cord is divided up into gray and white matter. Gray being composed of nerve cell bodies, white consisting of primarily of the axonal fibers covered in myelin. There are billions of cells that make up the nervous system. These cells transmit electrical and chemical messages. The cells act as relay stations between areas of the nervous system. cells that provide support in the way of nutrients, oxygen, and immune health. And then there are the chemicals of the nervous system that act as mediators and modulators for activity in various parts of the brain. So remember, some of these chemicals act as neurotransmitters, some act as hormones. It just depends on where they are located and what their primary mission is. Here are your references.